Hello, everyone. My name is Justin DeMeo, and I live in Carolina Beach in North Carolina. It's a great spot to live as a student simply because there's so much to do there. You can eat out on the island, you can surf on the beach, you can hike in the state park, and the fishing there is great. But why is it a good spot to fish? Well, looking at the geography of Carolina Beach, you can see that it's at the intersection of three major bodies of water. The Cape Fear River runs through this area, supplying an input of fresh water, and the Atlantic Ocean to the east is obviously a body of salt water. Together in this area creates an estuary where a diversity of species of fish is housed. Here at Carolina Beach, you can expect to catch many varieties of fish, including red and black drum, mackerel, different species of rays and sharks, trout, spotfish, and flounder. Okay, so fishing is done almost exclusively as a recreational thing in Carolina Beach, but these activities have led to declines in certain populations like flounder over the last decade, and this is leading to rules and regulations being created to control these populations. I've actually caught a flounder a few years back, and I threw it back in the water, but my parents would have let me keep it if we had a cooler to store it in. But in the near future, I probably won't even be allowed to do that or even be allowed to throw a line in the water to catch a flounder. And this is the many ways overfishing is starting to impact people's lives. But it's just a little fishing regulation, right? I'll live. Well, obviously, a measly fishing regulation isn't the only consequence attributed to overfishing. There is a large scope of impacts that it has, and today we will be talking about what should we really be worried about when it comes to overfishing. So overfishing, defined literally, is the depletion of stock of fish in a body of water by excessive fishing. Zooming out to a more broad scale, it's easier to see the effects of overfishing. For instance, an estimated 34% of the world's fish stocks suffer from overfishing today. The Atlantic Ocean's fish stocks suffer from an estimated 59% of overfishing. This in turn causes an array of other problems, which we will now be discussing. Okay, so there are two effects of overfishing that outweigh the rest by a pretty significant margin, according to those who study overfishing. And the first of those effects is the decline in population of big, large predatory fish, emphasis on predatory. So removing the top of the food chain from the picture induces something called cascading effects. And we can visualize this by looking at an actual food chain. So here is an example of a food chain where sharks are the top predator. And we're going to see what happens when we induce cascading effects on this food chain. So in this scenario, sharks will be removed from the food chain because they are overfished. But what happens to the rest of the food chain? Well, the unicorn fish will now ultimately be the new top of the food chain because they have less predators, so their population will increase. Since unicorn fish primarily prey on zooplankton, the population of zooplankton will decrease. And this alternation process continues all the way to the bottom of the food chain, affecting even the chemical composition of the water, which phytoplankton population controls. So most of the sources I've looked at agree with that schematic, but an important thing to realize is what species are typically overfished. For example, the most commonly consumed fish by humans is tuna, and tuna isn't always at the top of the food chain. So let's look at this infographic one more time, but this time we'll remove a fish from the middle of the food chain and see what happens. So we are going to use the same food chain as before. In this one, tuna will take the place of unicorn fish, and we are going to remove tuna first from the food chain. So if tuna is overfished in a specific ecosystem, the same cascading effects will apply. First, the population that is prey to tuna will increase, as they will have less predators now. and then the bottom of the food chain in this scenario would decrease. But what happens to the top of the food chain? Well, they too would decrease, seeing as they don't have any tuna to prey on. So in this scenario, even more of the food chain is depleted, and in both cases, large predatory fish are at risk. But overfishing of fish that aren't necessarily at the top of the food chain seems to have worse effects on an ecosystem, depleting both the top of the food chain and the second from the top. So regardless of the fact, both scenarios will cause issues, and both are initiated by overfishing, of course. So I agree with the scientists that are associating this as an urgent consequence of overfishing, but that is not the only consequence that is urgent. Habitat destruction amongst aquatic species is also commonly discussed as a huge concern. So habitats that are of particular interest among scientists are coral reefs. It's been said that the destruction of coral reefs means the destruction of many species of fish. But why? Why are coral reefs so important? Roughly 25% of all ocean fish depend on healthy coral reefs. The reefs, when healthy, have many nooks and crannies that are perfect breeding grounds to lay eggs, where the eggs will be protected and safe. These tight spaces in the reefs are free of predators that eat the young fish. The biodiversity around the reefs is amazing. Some reefs house up to 7,000 species of fish. The abundance of color in many healthy reefs is essential for aquatic life as it aids in camouflage from predators. Unsustainable fishing practices, paired with pollution and climate change, is contributing to the destruction of reefs, and we just discussed the overwhelming significance that reefs contribute to aquatic life. This makes this just as much of a concern as removing large predatory fish from a food chain, seeing as the destruction of reefs can diminish thousands of species. So, out of all the sources that I looked at in my literature review, most of them mention coral reefs, but what about other habitats, right? Because fish live in other places that aren't coral reefs. Well, there is another important habitat called the kelp forest, and the kelp forest is almost just as crucial as coral reefs, but none of the sources mention them. So how do kelp forests compare to coral reefs, and are they being affected by overfishing? Kelp forests have about the same biodiversity as coral reefs. The thick kelp and seaweed provides a perfect breeding ground for many types of fish. The kelp is also a source of food for many fish. It turns out that the kelp forests are affected by overfishing. Extensive fishing of key apex predators, like lobsters, is causing a sharp increase in sea urchins. Sea urchins, which consume the kelp, are diminishing the kelp forests. So we can visualize this by putting this scenario into the food chain diagrams we were looking at earlier. So we have the food chain mechanism with this situation where sea urchins consume kelp. Lobster, being the primary consumer of sea urchins, are being overfished and depleted. This is causing the sea urchin population to increase, since they aren't being consumed as much. In turn, the kelp forests are being depleted because of the increased demand for food from sea urchins. Atlantic cod, the main enemy of lobsters, will also decrease when lobsters are overfished. So to sum this all up, we looked at two commonly discussed catastrophic effects of overfishing. Many sources mention how these things are detrimental to fish, the environment, and even humans, but it's important to understand why. Large predatory fish are essential for ecosystem balance, and overfishing them will cause disturbances in that balance. But overfishing medium-sized fish can have the same, if not worse, effects on the ecosystem. So coral reefs are very important to many species of fish, and we discussed why that is. We also shed light on other habitats like the kelp forest and brought attention on how it can be depleted by overfishing as well. Overfishing has the potential to do so much damage to our planet and take the lives of many species of fish and even humans who rely on seafood for diet. Change must be made soon before these effects get worse.